Today, I'm gonna go through the best and the worst things about every brawler in Brawl Stars. If you haven't subscribed yet, then you're gonna want to, because I'm gonna post a part 2 and part 3 of this video. Anyways, I hope you enjoy. The best thing about Shelly is when you're able to use your super and spam clay pigeons on the enemy because they cannot walk away from it and they're just screwed. They can't do anything. And the worst thing about Shelly is when you're at max range and you can't do any damage to your enemies. The best thing about Nita is when the enemies cannot pierce your bear and it just obliterates them. Like, what is he supposed to do? And the worst thing about Nita is when they can pierce your bear and kill you at the same time. What are you supposed to do? The best thing about Colt is when you're able to hit full clips because it can almost one-shot certain brawlers in the game. And the worst thing about Colt is when the enemies walk in a different general direction from where you're shooting and you cannot hit every single bullet. Even if you predict them right, they could just walk out of it. But if you predict them right and you walk in the same direction as them, then you get a few more bullets. The best thing about Bull is when you can charge at them and stomp them in the face and literally obliterate them. And the worst thing about Bull is when you have to fight a Gale and somehow get up to him. How are you supposed to do that? The best part about Jessie is when you can slow your enemies and they have no way to get away from Scrappy. And the worst thing about Jessie is when you throw your turret and they have a thrower on their team and they destroy it immediately. It's basically useless. The best thing about Brock is his insane amount of splash damage. You don't even have to hit them at max range and you'll still hit them. And the worst thing about Brock is when you start your super and then somebody cancels it. And then you die. The best thing about Dynamite is when you can finally land a stun and just one-shot your enemy. And the worst thing about Dynamite is when you have to fight any assassin. The best thing about Bo is when your enemies have no idea that there's mines and then they get stunned and then they die. And the worst thing about Bo is when the enemy can easily trip your mines safely and kill you. The best thing about Tick is when you can make it so then your enemy has literally no way to safely approach you. And the worst thing about Tick is when your enemy has enough health to just walk through your mines and destroy you. The best thing about 8-Bit is when you're able to use your super to block some shots and then you can go in and one-shot them. And the worst thing about 8-Bit is when you have to fight somebody who has crazy long-range burst damage and you can't do anything. The best thing about Ems is how you can completely destroy tanks and assassins. And the worst thing about Ems is when your enemies can completely outrange you and stay out of your range forever and you get clapped. The best thing about Stu is when you pay $1 million a month for good internet and you can super over and over again. And the bad thing about Stu is when you don't pay $1 million a month for internet and you can only dash every once in a while. The best thing about El Primo is when you can get that throw and super combo. It's beautiful. And the worst thing about El Primo is when you have to fight any tank counter. The best thing about Barley is when you can use your insane splash to hit a bunch of targets at once. And the worst thing about Barley is when you have to fight any assassin because they can destroy you. The best thing about Poco is when you can obliterate your enemies and full heal yourself at the same time. And the worst thing about Poco is when you fight somebody who can anti-heal you, outrange you, and just obliterate you. The best thing about Rosa is when you fight an overconfident assassin who really has no chance against you. And the worst thing about Rosa is when you have to fight Gale. What can you do? The best thing about Rico is when you can go super fast and avoid literally every single shot coming at you. And the worst thing about Rico is when they can finally hit you. The best thing about Daryl is when you can easily assassinate really squishy brawlers. And the worst thing about Daryl is when you have to fight a Gale. What can you do? The best thing about Penny is when you can pierce through enemies and completely destroy them. And the worst thing about Penny is when you fight somebody who could pierce through anything you have and completely destroy you. The best thing about Carl is when you can easily outrange, outdamage, and even assassinate any enemy you fight. And the worst thing about Carl is when you have to fight somebody who can easily outmaneuver your attacks and really anything that you throw at them. The best thing about Jackie is when you can pull enemies out of position and then 3-shot them. And the worst thing about Jackie is when you have to fight a Gale. What can you do against Gale? This guy is a problem. The best thing about Gus is when you can shield enemy damage and then you can 2-shot them with your cookie popper gadget. He's really good. And the worst thing about Gus is brawlers who make it really hard to get your shield. Leave a like and subscribe for part 2.